Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 20 July, 2024. It is the 154th anniversary of the birth of Herbert Eugene Bolton, who was born on a farm in rural Wisconsin on this date in 1870. Bolton is remembered for the Bolton Thesis, also known as the Bolton Theory, which is the view that the history of the Americas is properly hemispherical history and should be understood and taught as such. Bolton then is part of a larger pattern of the expansion of historical inquiry, but I want to qualify this claim a bit. Bolton wasn't interested in expanding the scope of history for its own sake, or so as to guarantee the employment of more historians. His interest in expanding the American story to hemispherical history grew directly out of his research in Latin American history. Here is how Bolton described the task of the historian of the Western Hemisphere from his 1933 paper, The Epic of Greater America. Quote, "In recent years, the range of investigation in Western Hemisphere history has vastly broadened. This is due to in no small part to the influence of Jameson's Guides to Foreign Archives, to the work of American and Canadian scholars on British America, of the students of the Caribbean, and of the historians of the frontier, of the whole galaxy of Hispanists, of the social, cultural, economic, institutional, and diplomatic historians, the international relationists, and a host of others. Our historical data have not only become greater in amount, but much more complex in character. Phases and factors formerly undreamed of have come to light. Many of the new discoveries do not fit into the nationalistic pattern," unquote. Bolton is here contrasting a hemispherical history to national histories that take as their narrative focus the history of a single nation state. He goes on to point out that the kind of hemispherical historical research he believes is needed in order to accurately understand the development of individual nation states of the Western Hemisphere. Quote, "Who has written the history of the introduction of European plants and animals into the Western Hemisphere as a whole, or of the spread of cattle and horse raising from Patagonia to Labrador? Who has written on a Western Hemisphere scale the history of shipbuilding and commerce, mining, Christian missions, Indian policies, slavery and emancipation, constitutional development, arbitration, the effects of the Indian on European cultures, the rise of the common man, art, architecture, literature, or science? Who has tried to state the significance of the frontier in terms of the Americas?" Unquote. Bolton started out as an historian of the American West and came to his idea of hemispherical history by way of pushing outward from the American heartland into the borderlands. Since the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, there have always been shifting borderlands between the geographical regions of influence of the various European powers. Most obviously, there is the borderland that separates but also connects Latin America, settled by the Spanish and the Portuguese, and the bulk of North America, settled by the peoples of Northern Europe. Wilbur R. Jacobs wrote of Bolton on borderlands, quote, "His borderlands history struck many historians as way out, a fringe area to Spanish America and a fringe area to the United States and thus to the American West. His Spanish borderlands are rejected by Latin Americanists and neglected by historians of the West. The general histories and bibliographies of Latin America often are construed as though these outlying provinces were never Spanish. Western writers tend to treat them as though they were an exotic prior figuration extraneous to all that developed later," unquote. We can see that the Bolton thesis was not immediately embraced. Even today, it isn't a well-known idea, and certainly it's much less familiar than that much more familiar thesis, the Turner thesis. But the two ideas aren't entirely disjoint. Turner's frontier can be understood as a special case of a borderland between civilization and the wilderness, and Bolton's hemispherical history can be understood as a generalization of the Turner thesis, among other things. It's not only that, but it can be interpreted as that way, although Bolton did not himself interpret it that way. It's worth noting that Bolton was a student of Frederick Jackson Turner, but Bolton is said to have rejected the Turner thesis, that is the role of the frontier in shaping American life, which is usually interpreted as a key constituent of American exceptionalism. So one can guess at the logic that's at work here. Insofar as U.S. history must be seen in the context of wider hemispherical history, this calls American exceptionalism into question. I don't think that Bolton would have denied the vital role of the frontier in American history, but he would have expanded this to the role of the frontiers in the Americas so that the Turner thesis takes on a generalized form in the Western Hemisphere. And Turner himself was aware of the potential generalizations of his thesis. In his famous 1893 paper, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, Turner wrote, quote, "What the Mediterranean Sea was to the Greeks, breaking the bond of custom, offering new experiences, calling out new institutions and activity, that and more, the ever-retreating frontier has been to the United States directly and to the nations of Europe more remotely," unquote. If the concept of the frontier was equally applicable to the Mediterranean Sea for the ancient Greeks, then the frontier is not exclusively about American exceptionalism. Discussing Turner and Bolton together brings me back to what I said earlier about wanting to qualify the claim that Bolton was part of the larger pattern of the expansion of the scope of historical inquiry. I said that Bolton wasn't interested in expanding the scope of history for its own sake. He wasn't driven by any theoretical program in history. Ever since Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, historians have tried to go beyond simple records in the form of annals and chronicles. And this was especially true after the appearance of what came to be called philosophical history during the Enlightenment, with practitioners like Edward Gibbon and Friedrich von Schlegel. Philosophical history was just an attempt to provide explanations for historical events and processes. As a part of an effort to explain history and not merely to describe it, historians have felt the inner logic of their narrative drive them to push the boundaries of their inquiry outward. In any explanation that aims at completeness, there is always another cause to take account of that's further out. And pursuing these causes pushes the boundaries of a history further and further out, just as Bolton found himself pushed out into the Spanish borderlands in his attempt to account for and explain the American frontier. The Bolton thesis then came out of this milieu of historical explanation and not out of a theoretical commitment to the expansion of the scope of history. It's worth pointing this out because some historians have been critical of history they deem to be motivated by theoretical concerns rather than by history itself. Here I'm thinking of Jeffrey Elton and what he called thesis-dominated history. Elton wrote, quote, "It will have become clear in this analysis of method that I am confining the term history to one of the two disciplines that lay claim to it. These two I may call empirical or thesis-free and determinist or thesis-dominated. By thesis, I here mean a general scheme of interpretation regarded as universally applicable, as derived from laws discoverable in the historical process, and as possessed of powers of prediction," unquote. We can see there the resemblance to Popper, but I just mentioned that for the moment. It could be argued that the Bolton thesis and the Turner thesis are paradigm cases of what Elton called thesis-dominated history. Another obvious example would be the Pirenne thesis on the origins of the Middle Ages. But Turner and Bolton and Pirenne are no more abstract and theoretical in their motivation than was Elton. And I would further argue that it is not possible to write a history that is free from what Elton called a general scheme of interpretation. That being said, we could still make the case for Bolton being an historian with theoretical interests, and it's worth noting that the arguments Bolton makes for hemispherical history can be extended to the planet entire to make for planetary history. So what is planetary history? There is a contemporary philosopher of history, Zoltan Boldazar Simon, who in his Planetary Futures, Planetary History says, quote, "As the futures ahead gain a planetary character, our historical understanding cannot escape being planetary too," unquote. By planetary history, Simon has something more in mind than merely expanding the scope of history to include all that happens on Earth. He sees planetary history as a setting for humanity that is poised upon ventures that imply history of planetary scope as being more than a neutral backdrop for human action. Quote, "Utopian or dystopian, human futures are inextricably bound with larger planetary futures. They are constitutive of one another in mutual interactions instead of the planet being simply the frame or background of human activities," unquote. He also argues that we can no longer accept a division between the natural history and human history. Quote, "We cannot content ourselves with categories that separately apply to human and natural sciences," unquote. I wouldn't express myself in exactly the same terms, but I agree with pretty much all of these contentions. Moreover, we can find early glimmerings of the need for planetary history in Bolton. The introduction of European plants and animals into the Western Hemisphere, which Bolton mentioned, has a prehistory in the distribution of plants and animals in the Old World before Columbus, and it has a counterpart in the introduction of plants and animals from the Americas into the Old World, the totality of which today we call the Columbian Exchange. Similarly, the history of shipbuilding and commerce, mining, Christian missions, Indian policies, slavery and emancipation, constitutional development, arbitration, and so on, all of these things Bolton mentioned, all have a planetary history that is the larger context of the hemispherical history of the Americas. It would be convenient to be able to set up a tidy schematism of how history has evolved from strictly local history to national history through regionalism, which ultimately includes hemispherical history, and ultimately issues in planetary history. But this is a little too tidy to be completely true. However, this can be a fruitful approach to understand what went on in history in greater detail. Suppose we identify the high point of nationalistic European historiography as being the 19th century. If we do this, perhaps identifying figures like Jules Michelet under the influence of Giambattista Vico, we have to acknowledge that at the same time, von Ranke was bringing to maturity a method of source criticism in historical writing that many still continue to be the definitive standard of historical writing. And Ranke himself began a monumental universal history that he never finished. So the 19th century was by no means an unchallenged and exclusive time of nationalistic history, although we do find some of the most influential national histories being written in the 19th century. However, national histories need not be exclusively understood as being hidebound and provincial. The history of a nation entire, especially such a history that seeks the earliest origins of a people in time, represents a more comprehensive historical inquiry than the local historians that were written by antiquarians. Also, there's a question of what came before nationalistic histories. Partly the answer to this is the local histories that I just mentioned, but we have to go all the way back to Herodotus to find all the many traditions of historical writings and the relative degree of comprehensiveness that have been involved in these historical writings. Herodotus was, I think, more comprehensive than Thucydides, but Thucydides gained in clarity and arguably gained in focus by narrowing in on the Peloponnesian War. The two histories of Herodotus and Thucydides are, in a sense, very different histories due to the author's differing conception of the historian's task, which includes the proper scope of the historian's task. And still in antiquity, Augustine's City of God was a kind of universal history, and it inspired more modern universal histories such as that of Bossuet. What I think we can say here is that the idea of the nation state with a distinctive national history took time to develop from the formal establishment of the nation state following the 30 Years' War and the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. 150 years later, after the Treaty of Westphalia, with the Enlightenment intervening and the 19th century beginning, the nation state was sufficiently familiar that it could, at that time, be thematized as an object of historical research. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution led to many European nation states questioning their identity because of the wrenching changes that came along as a result of industrialization. Prior to the Treaty of Westphalia, the nation state did not effectively exist, except in the most tenuous anticipations, so there could be no history of the nation state written. After the advent of the nation state, it still took time for the nation state to mature as an object of historical scholarship and an object of historical knowledge. By the same reasoning, we can see pre-nationalistic historiography as the prehistory of history, which has a history of thousands of years behind it. Once we reach the age of nation states and nationalistic history, then history can begin to become more comprehensive, passing through regional history and hemispherical history to eventually arrive at planetary history. Under this schematism, universal histories of the early modern period represent an anticipation of the true universal histories yet to be written after the dawn of planetary history. None of this, of course, is to be found in Bolton, but we can slot Bolton into this overall development if we want to do so. As I said, it's a little bit too tidy to be true, but there is an element of truth in it. So happy birthday, Herbert Eugene Bolton, and thanks for listening.